Anderson Senior Award for Outstanding Leadership. Stephen? Congratulations. Couldn't have gone to a better person. All right. Well, I mean, our Jay's over there, though. Yeah. Okay. All right. As some of you heard, our guest last weekend, Dr. Charles Marsh, the author of the most recent biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, had quite an adventure in his travels to and from Manhattan. On his way out, because of delays, instead of flying his intended route from Charlottesville to Chicago to Manhattan, he ended up flying from Charlottesville to LaGuardia Airport in New York City to Kansas City because of a long delay in Charlottesville. On the way back to Charlottesville, he had 2 canceled flights, ended up spending the night at an O'Hare Airport hotel. But my point of saying all this is that when he finally made it home, he sent me a text which included these words: "My journey home proved even more eventful than the outbound. Still, it is worth it all to meet your inspiring and generous parishioners." His words go along with what I've always said about the high character of this congregation. You know, several years ago, we were waiting at the border on the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda, the border that separates 2 countries in the eastern part of Congo, on our way home to Kigali, Rwanda, and to begin our flight back to the States. As we waited for the agents to go through all of our baggage and check our passports at a border that separates 2 countries that really do not hold a lot of love and respect for each other, I noticed a man carrying a bag which said Doctors Without Borders, the humanitarian organization known for its work in war-torn regions, especially in developing countries. I thought to myself at the time how wonderful it was for this individual to work beyond the borders, or probably his own comfort zone, to serve others and to hopefully help lift people up and maybe even help break down the borders of mistrust and suspicion between nations. You know, in a perfect world, we know that there would be no need for border agents to secure ours or anybody's safety, or to protect ours or anybody's interest. But as we know, we live in a fallen world. Therefore, the need to stand guard against any threat to the security of any nation. Over 30 years ago, when Saudi Arabian Prince Sultan bin Salman Al Saud went into space, it was one of the most incredible experiences of his life, as you can imagine. He said, "I think the minute I saw the view for the first time was one of the most memorable moments in my entire life." When asked by a reporter how it changed his understanding of God, one of the prince's comments was, "It really strengthens your convictions. Looking at it from space, the trouble is all over the world, not just in the Middle East. Look very strange as you see all the boundaries and borders disappearing." And so from this space perspective, I can't say that I've ever had it, one sees the world the way God intended it to be. Absent of conflict, trust between nations, peace on earth, borderless in a sense of mutual respect and cooperation. But again, we know we live in a world full of suspicion, which runs high. Words escalate. Relationships, we know, can quickly deteriorate. The borders we create turn into deeper lines than perhaps we had ever imagined. Now, as Christians, we are not exempt from wanting clearly defined borders to protect our own families and our personal welfare. Just the simple boundaries of one's home gives one a sense of security and privacy. We're not exempt as Christians from desiring a national identity, and therefore a national pride. We're not exempt as Christians from taking pride in our family name, our family culture, our family heritage, borders that give us a sense as to who we are. We're not exempt from wanting to call ourselves Presbyterians or Methodists or Baptists or Catholics or non-denominationalists. There is security that comes in everything from surrounding ourselves with perhaps like-minded people with similar values. You remember that old story of the man who arrives at the pearly gates and St. Peter asks him, "Religion?" The man says, "Methodist." St. Peter says to him, he looks down the list, he says, "Well, go to room 24, but be really quiet when you pass room 8. Woman arrives at pearly gates, St. Peter asks, "Religion?" "Lutheran." "Go to room 18, but be very quiet when you walk past room 8. Another person arrives at the pearly gates, and St. Peter asks, "Religion?" "Baptist." "Go to room 11, but be very quiet when you pass room 8. The man says, I can understand there being different rooms for different denominations, but why must I be so quiet when I pass room 8? Well, the Presbyterians are in room 8, and they think that they are the only ones here. See, it's a little pride in being Presbyterian, right? A little pride in being a Methodist. Presbyterian doctrine, though, has always understood that by virtue of our fallen nature, we will never be free of borders and boundaries securing us and protecting us from the outside. Norman MacLean, in his book, A River Runs Through It, said, "As a Scot and a Presbyterian, my father believed that man by nature was just a mess, and that he had fallen from his original state of grace. But he would always say that only by picking up God's rhythms can man regain his power and beauty." Not too unlike the spirit of Reinhold Niebuhr's Serenity Prayer, often attributed to an anonymous source, but actually written by the New York theologian, God, give us grace to accept with serenity the things that cannot be changed, courage to change the things which should be changed, and wisdom to know the difference. And so when we look at things from a macro sense, so to speak, it's easy to throw up your arms and lament that we all live with this handicap of self-centeredness. We all live in a fallen state, far from the state of grace in which God intended us to be. But from the micro sense, God gives us the courage and the compassion to step out beyond our borders to make a difference in another person's life. That's why the story of Philip and the Ethiopian, read by Mary this morning, and the basis for our sermon, represents the reality of national and cultural borders, but also the breaking down of personal barriers that separate us from one another. Philip and the baptism of the Ethiopian is a microcosm of the way we should all live in respect to going beyond our boundaries, our comfort zones, to make the world a better place in which to live. Philip, in his encounter with the Ethiopian court official, who was presumably on his way back to Ethiopia from his trip to Jerusalem celebrating the Passover, he knew that the Ethiopian was at the point of receiving and embracing Christ. And because he was a eunuch, there was no telling how he was received in Jerusalem. But there is no doubt that he could have gotten a stiff arm instead of open arms. But this made little difference to Philip. He just jumped into the Ethiopian's chariot, and quickly they became brothers in Christ. And that's what Philip was all about after following Jesus, after seeing his crucifixion, after witnessing his resurrection, making the kingdom borderless with the baptism of the Ethiopian, sending him on his way, celebrating that he had just received Christ, mainly due to the efforts of Philip. This gracious spirit, similar to what our Lord said in the parable of the feast, when the man sent out invitations to the people in the streets, including the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. No one was excluded. Borderless hospitality, borderless outreach. Now, in light of all this, isn't this one of the chief things that we strive as Christians? To put aside the borders that separate us from one another, socioeconomically, racially, politically, geographically, culturally. We do not want to fall under the indictment of James, or of Jesus' brother James, when he wrote in the book of James, you are guilty of creating distinctions among yourselves. So we become borderless in our personal attitude toward one another when we reach out, as Christ did, across territorial lines. Now, we are aware, of course, of the purpose that create borders, that create sovereign nations. But as Christians, in a personal way, we are to live our lives in borderless ways, no matter the person, no matter the problem. Quite frankly, Jesus wants to see evidence of this in our lives. As he said in Matthew, you know, if you only love those who love you, what reward will you have? Even the tax collectors can do that. I was reading a few days ago in the Washington Post excerpts of an interview with actor Brad Pitt, who discussed his struggles with alcohol and the pain of his recent divorce. He said that in this period in his life, he's really been about looking at his weaknesses and failures and owning up, as he said, to my side of the street and not wasting so much time, he said, on hollow pursuits. But this next statement illustrates how someone different than us, both from an experience and a cultural standpoint, can teach us important lessons. He kept coming back to the story about an African mother that he met once. She had lost 9 of her family members to tragedy in war. But, he said, she had this biggest laugh that he had ever heard. One could ask, what would be the source of this happiness? What would be the source of this faith? However much he was feeling sorry for himself, he realized then the magnitude of pain others had. When you break down the borders and you learn from others, how refreshing and renewing it can really be. So when you think about it, the simplest and easiest way to break down borders and to have a borderless attitude toward others, no matter the person, no matter the difference, is simply to pay attention to Jesus' commandment when he said, love your neighbor as yourself. Governor John Kasich, in his most recent book called Two Paths, writes, what does God mean when he commands us to love our neighbor? He's telling us to enable our neighbor to help him achieve what he wants to achieve. If someone's experiencing hard times and is in need of a job, help them out. If someone's in pain, comfort her. If someone has a great victory, don't let them celebrate alone. If someone is angry at you, find a way to make amends. All this said, what better way to live a borderless life? 60 Minutes last week featured Mayor of New York City and philanthropist Michael Bloomberg and his attitude toward giving and helping. Now, you may agree with him or disagree with him politically, but that's beside the point. He said at the beginning of the broadcast that you can't take your money with you, right? In this case, it's $47 billion. So he's going to spend it on people and causes that will help bring the world together. In other words, the more we work together and the more we help one another, the more borderless, right, we will become. His many outreaches include teaching language skills to low-income families, improving the lives of inner-city elderly men and women, combating road traffic deaths in low-income countries, women's economic development in Africa, helping low-income countries improve public health, obstetric care for women in developing countries, medical research, the list goes on and on and on and on. When asked by the 60-minute correspondent at the end of the broadcast, is there anything you want that you don't have? Michael Bloomberg simply and confidently said, I like what I see when I look in the mirror. So, when I get to heaven, I'm not sure if I'm going to stand for an interview because I'm going right in. He thinks God will judge you on what you do and how much you help others. It can be said, too, that God will judge us on how much we break down barriers and build others up. The writer in Ecclesiastes said, for everything there is a season and time for every matter under heaven. There is a time to tear down, and there's a time to build up. As was mentioned earlier, owning your side of the street. On your side of the street comes, and for me, obviously, comes the responsibility to break down a barrier. And you normally do it, my friends, by simply loving your neighbor as yourself. When Philip encountered the Ethiopian and he climbed into his chariot and he took him down to the river and he baptized him, he was owning his side of the street, you see, for reaching out to someone totally unlike him in every way. And so, what will be yours and my next move on our sides of the street?